Welcome back to another episode of The Beginner's Guide to the 18th Century. My name is Kendall, and I am really thrilled to bring you today's guest, who is the Associate Curator of Costume and Textiles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I doubt I even need to say his name now because you probably know who it is. Neal Hurst, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is very exciting. We have lots to cover today because you do so much. And you've been doing what you do for a really long time. So I think that people are going to get a lot of value out of our conversation today, especially beginners. And I know that you really enjoy helping people get started and understand this whole 18th century living history crazy thing that we do, right? So why don't you give us a little or a lot of background info about how did Neal Hurst wind up at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation doing what you're doing today?
Well, geez, I have to reach back into the back part of the brain here, but I became very interested in sort of living history and reenacting and such, mostly due to when I first saw the movie Gettysburg, of all things. I just thought that was so interesting. The history aspect. I always had a long interest in history as a kid, growing up. Reading history, whatever I can get my hands on. But I remember a good friend of mine and myself and Chris saw this advertisement in a newspaper for a reenactment unit, the 97th Pennsylvania. They were sort of holding this, recruitment reenactment thing. It was just a single unit at a local park, and we're like, yeah, let's go check it out. And we were at the time probably in middle school, maybe even elementary school, quite honestly. And so we went out there, and it had poured, or was still pouring, and so there was really nothing going on. And they had set up underneath these sort of pavilions, and that's sort of where we got our first introduction, and really sparked our interest in doing this sort of thing known as reenacting. So all through middle school and high school, Chris and I had joined the 97th and started reenacting there initially. And it's funny because I think most living historians and folks who get into these hobbies kind of have a trajectory in some way. And Chris and I had always we enjoyed museums. We went to museums. I was fascinated with objects in those museums, and so I quickly, once I had purchased my first uniform and stuff, I became I really didn't like it, as it didn't look like what I was actually seeing in the museums. So that sort of propelled me into a sort of another area of just trying to learn more and more about historical sewing and construction and materials. That kind of kept going all through high school and into my early college years. And essentially, I ended up moving. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, but moved down to Norfolk, Virginia, where I started at Old Dominion University, actually as a music major of all things, but eventually left there. Just at that time, honestly, just really wasn't ready for school yet. So I left and then started working. At the same time, I was also working at Jamestown Settlement, part of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. So I was interpreting 17th century, dressing up in costume, and interpreting the fort site there. And so I was doing that, and then a full-time position opened up at their sister site at Yorktown. So I began working there. And so while I was working there, I met another fellow named Andrew Delisle. And he had mentioned that he had a good friend that he had joined, and he was a member of this reenactment unit known as the York County Militia, which is also since dissolved. Like so many of these units, I feel like I've joined. And so through Andrew and the York County, I met a whole slew of folks here on the peninsula that were reenactors. Jay Howlett, who is here at Colonial Williamsburg, Valentine Povinelli as well. I mean, there's just a whole huge amount of folks who, certainly had influence on myself as a young reenactor, just getting into the Rev War. And so that again sparked my interest, looking at stuff, trying to get my hands on as much as I can in order to sort of recreate objects, to create them as close as we can get them to the 18th century. That's sort of always been my goal. And so once I had worked at Yorktown for about a year or so, Jay had mentioned to me that there was going to be an apprentice tailor's position opening up at Colonial Williamsburg. It would be the first time that they would be bringing on that trade sort of as an apprentice trade. So it sparked my interest. I've always been interested in sewing. I've been doing a lot of sewing. I'd worked in the costume shops at Jamestown and Yorktown. So I applied for it, and then I was offered that position. And so I worked as an apprentice tailor for, I think it was 6 years. And so at the end of that, I then received my journeyman papers from Colonial Williamsburg as a journeyman tailor. And then I subsequently left. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I still really wanted to finish my undergraduate. And so I had actually started community college locally here and got my associates from Thomas Nelson Community College, and then did my undergraduate bachelor's degree at the College of William and Mary in history. And so I did all that, and then I also worked quite a bit on, and I think it's funny. I think most people know me for my research on hunting shirts, and that was my undergraduate thesis at William and Mary. So that was sort of completed there, and from there, I knew I was always interested in, again, always sort of based in objects, what those stories can tell us about from these objects. Reenacting kind of had taken a little bit of a wayside with getting married, all those life things that happens, school, but I was still always interested in research and objects. So I had met while I was tailoring several individuals, one specifically Samantha Dorsey, who was at this place called Winneter, and I had then subsequently met other folks who had gone there, and really sparked my interest, again, because of the object focus that they have in terms of studying American material culture. So I applied to that program and was accepted, and I did my master's there at the University of Delaware and through the Winneter program. And I was very fortunate when I graduated that I then moved over and started working for the Museum of the American Revolution, and was on their sort of inaugural, sort of the initial curatorial team for the exhibits there, and planning those exhibits, and writing those exhibits, and all kinds of sort of hands going into that to make that huge and great museum sort of come to life. So I was there for a couple of years, and then Linda Baumgarten, who was the curator of costume and textiles here at Colonial Williamsburg, retired after 40 years. And I was very fortunate to be able to come back to Colonial Williamsburg and curate the costume and textile collection here. Excitingly, we do have a new costume gallery opening. It'll probably be open next Thanksgiving, with a exhibit from a private collector of some great 18th and 19th century objects. So again, sticking with sort of what these objects can tell, and what their stories can tell, and what the objects can tell themselves, has always long been my interest, and still continues to be that today. But with that, I still make clothing here and there. A lot of my work, though, at this point goes to other museums looking for sort of exact reproductions from important pieces in their collection, or pieces that just don't survive. I've recently completed a set of garments for Mount Vernon to represent some of the enslaved liveried servants that were there. So we have great historical records on those objects, and even some pictorial evidence of what they were wearing, but no object that we know of at this point survives. So I was able to recreate those for Mount Vernon, and they're on display there. And lastly, right before the pandemic broke out, I had finished and it's still needs to be mailed out, but I'd finished a copy of Tench Tillman's uniform for the Maryland Historical Society, uniform that was made probably about 1780, 1781, and has been in their collection since I think as early as the 1840s. But it's one of these things that's sort of their pride and joy. And it's a very important piece that survives. But its time on display can be helped with this reproduction, and the reproduction can be used for a variety of other things. But these are these types of objects that we want to have last another 200 years or more. Textiles are just one of these things. Unfortunately, when we talk about the originals, they do have a life, so we want to keep them going up that bell curve, because generally, once you reach the other side, it's very, very quick fall. So these reproductions are a good option for individuals, particularly if you want folks to handle them or try them on or whatever it might be.
That's an incredible journey. That's a long and exciting road that you have been on to be where you are, and that's so fantastic that you're doing the thing that you've always loved the most. And
very lucky. I am
yeah.
very, very fortunate and very lucky.
So I've lots and lots of thoughts about
Sure.
things. One thing I'm really curious about, all of your years of having access to these extant garments and these collection items, are there things that you find yourself gravitating towards more than others, things that are some of your favorite kind of material culture objects?
Yeah, I always gravitate to things where we have a provenance, just because now we can actually put a person. Granted, a person always wore one of these garments no matter what, but now we can really put a person, at a place and time who wore that garment. So I tend to gravitate to those a lot, but those are very rare.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes even then the notes and the history that's passed down with the garments aren't always true. But we still have to take that provenance with a grain of salt. There is probably some truth to it, but it's always worth just being careful when trying to associate things.
Right.
But and particularly since I trained as a tailor, I've always had a deeper interest in menswear, which is also another sort of at least I feel a rare thing.
Mm-hmm.
Menswear is very quickly, other than military things, but sort of men's civilian wear seems to always sort of quickly go by the wayside. And I'm not sure if it's just we find more women who are reenactors, or the guys who are just more interested in the military side of things. But I've always had a deep interest in sort of understanding, particularly tailoring, and how it has evolved over the years, because it does evolve very strangely. Over the time period that many people that we'll be talking to here reenact. From the, let's say, the French and Indian War through the early Napoleonic period, or War of 1812 era.
That was actually going to be my next question. I was having a conversation with somebody recently about sort of the evolution of just being in reenacting. If you've been a reenactor for 20 or 30 years, and
Sure.
What the style of the clothing was back in the day, and how I guess it's just research, and now we have technology and we have this access that wasn't there before. I mean, you obviously are the expert in this, and so you can answer that. But it does seem like there is quite an evolution in fashion, living history fashion, over these
Sure.
last 20, 30 years. So how does that happen? Is it because there's just more access? How do we go from, I guess, say, mob caps were okay and acceptable, and now mob caps are the enemy? I'm probably being dramatic there, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it is interesting, and even in my own sort of career as a reenactor, I've seen these kind of changes before. I think I wasn't alive during the bicentennial, but you certainly have the resources that were the resources that were available. These sort of what historians would refer to as their historiography. Sketchbook 76. rural Pennsylvania clothing. I'm just trying to think of Beth Gilgan's book, Tidings from the 18th Century. I mean, these were seminal publications that were used during, let's just say the American Bicentennial, and they were used for quite some time. And honestly, they're excellent books. But I think what has sort of propelled sort of even more in-depth look at some of this is the availability of these objects for people to look at, the sort of accessibility. But I always remind folks that these museum collections are held in public trust. And they should be made completely accessible as long as it's safe, and the objects aren't going to fall apart or something. They should be accessible to a certain degree for individuals to study. And I try my best for folks who are coming to look at objects here to make those objects accessible, as long as our schedules work out and so on and so forth. But things like runaway databases, newspaper articles from the period, literature that's available from the 18th and 19th century that's now available for people to keyword search, e-museums that have tons and tons of photos on them for construction details, individuals who just have a better understanding of what textiles they were using. But also, I think, an interest in as sort of making things, but to make them with a historically accurate manner, and things like sewing something by hand versus using a sewing machine, because there are two different ways of putting things together, and that's one thing that in workshops that I teach through Burnley and Trowbridge and other places, there is a distinct difference between the way somebody puts together an object with a machine and with by hand, and these evolve in the 19th century once that machine is invented. But I think that sort of access to material, though, and these and individuals who are sort of collating this information, which I just find incredible, through Pinterest and all these sort of link pages. It's just a little overwhelming sometimes, but to have that sort of at your fingertips now, becomes really, really handy for somebody, I think, who's just starting. For the individual who is just getting into the revolutionary or 18th century sort of reenacting, you can make some pretty good choices from the get-go, and don't have to run yourself into buying something off the rack that's not what you really like. But if you have the time and want to invest that time, you can. And there's a lot of folks out there who put some really good research for individuals who are just starting out.
That's the main reason that I started the Beginner's Guide to the 18th Century, the membership site and this YouTube channel and all of those things, because I having just started out 2.5 years ago, what I struggled with was, and I say this all the time, but coming in and not even knowing what to look for, not knowing the terminology, getting really overwhelmed. I think there are so many resources for everybody, no matter what level you're at. It just can be hard to find them. And so being able to curate those into sort of one place is what I found would be impactful for people coming in. When you do an 18th century, whatever search, being able to kind of find that at the top of Google, because I think for me, it was that confusion of stays and corsets and what is what. And then just that whole, I say that mob cap, I say it jokingly, but honestly, people would say mob cap and I didn't even understand. They'd be like, well, it's kind of like a cotton shower cap or whatever with an elastic band. And I'm like, I don't know the difference. I don't know so if you don't have that, what do you have? I think those, because there's so many articles and pieces of clothing and accessories and things to wearing these clothes, it gets overwhelming if you're brand new. I would love to, I think you're the perfect person for us to have this conversation. I would love to kind of put to bed a couple of misnomers out there. So we talked about mob caps, and there is actually in the Beginner's Guide, Jess Young from Penny River Costumes gives she actually made her own mob cap. So she made a big oversized one, and she tells you exactly the difference. And I love that. That's really helpful. But For women's, I want to definitely get back to men's clothing because I think that's important too. But for women starting out, and you touched on it, go buy something off the rack that you're going to realize that's not the right thing.
Yeah.
This is a question I get, and I wonder if you get it too. The whole jumps versus stays.
Mm.
And the going back to what people were wearing in the past in the context of reenacting. So can we bury that? Can we put that to bed?
You know, what I find interesting, one is what survives. There are a lot of jumps that survive. A garment that might be lightly boned, it may button or tie or pin. It could be quilted for its structure. Oftentimes they are embroidered. So there's a lot of things that could define a pair of jumps, but I think generally speaking, it's probably the easiest way to sort of encompass all of them is that they aren't fully structured, like you're going to find a pair of stays would be. But in terms of what are people wearing them for? It's a good question, and that we do have some historic documents and references to them, some references for maternity and nursing, for older women. I believe there's a reference. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's Mrs. Carter from here in Virginia, when she believes she has cancer and she's wearing a very lightly formed, I think she calls it a pair of jumps. And so it's being commented on by a tutor by the name of Philip Vickers-Fithian. And I could be completely misquoting this, but I believe she mentions wearing them. So again, here in this case, sort of a sickness. They could be worn for warmth. Maybe they're being worn underneath the stays or over top of them for warmth. But I think there's a lot of uses for them. But I think most women in the 18th century are going to be wearing stays as their support garment for the bust and back, as that's generally what you're going to find the gown fit over when they have a gown made by the mantua maker.
In modern terms, in a modern context of reenacting, I think what the confusion, this is what people have asked me who are new, especially because it's easy to go find an outfit online that includes these jumps worn over some sort of shift type thing with some sort of petticoat type thing. And then that's your outfit, right? And I think that's where the issue comes in, that people are confused. And so if they don't know, if you just go look up 18th century outfit dress, you do that search, you're going to come across a lot of stuff that probably doesn't fall in the realm of historical accuracy. And you may, people always say, if you're going to be with a regiment, you need to go to the regiment first. And obviously before you go spend money, you need to know. But sometimes people are just coming in and they want to go volunteer for a site, or they want to do these things, and they start getting that stuff, and they don't, or maybe they have a regiment that doesn't have a lot of women, or doesn't have options for that.
There's lots of inroads into this hobby, whether it's sort of cosplay or Hamilton or
Outlander.
Sure. I mean, so there's lots of inroads, and then of course with all that, there's lots of varying degrees of authenticity. So that's going to be the person who's going to be making the object or buying it. That's certainly, they need to ask themselves that. Am I trying to be as close to X person or X area in 1774 or whatever it might be? But these are certainly all good good questions to ask yourself before sort of delving into whatever it is you might be trying to buy.
Right. And so people are asking like, oh, well, did they wear jumps? And so it's not always a black and white answer, because it's like, well, they probably did, but they probably didn't wear what's being sold as fashion on Etsy. So it's, I
Sure.
think it's, again, it's important to just kind of, that's, that stuff can really trip you up though when you're starting out. That stuff
Oh
can
yeah.
get really confusing and overwhelming.
Even if you're portraying a regiment, a specific regiment, it can be very difficult to figure out exactly what women are going to be wearing for that. And also regionally as well. What a person is wearing in Williamsburg, Virginia, is going to be different in some way than it will be in Philadelphia or Boston or Newport. It may be a textile difference, it may be a fashion difference, but so all these things are things worthwhile to think about, when starting an impression for the first time.
What is your advice for someone who is maybe somebody who's just kind of sitting on the sidelines watching some of these episodes and online and following people, but hasn't quite maybe either found a site or a regiment and is trying to figure out how to put their toe in or jump in? Do you have any advice for people? Because I imagine you are probably getting questions from people all of the time about all of these things.
Yeah, I think for me, when I look back at the things that I bought and, just the money that I've spent on this hobby, um, feel comfortable asking people questions. Try to find primary sources.
Mhm.
For guys, it's a little bit harder because there's not as much published on menswear. For women, there is lots. Really at this point, it's not that it's overwhelming, but there is a lot of resources out there for making women's clothing. Just trying to make yourself as informed as you possibly can on that subject that you're trying to whatever the object is that you're trying to recreate. So that's great. If you have that aspect of it, but now you have the layers of, okay, materials. Where do I go for materials? What kind of materials? And so there's obviously lots of great resources that you can use. Probably the end all be all is Florence Montgomery's Textiles in America, which is sort of a dictionary type of book that will give you ideas of what these materials are supposed to be. But though that then has to translate into what you purchase, and that can be hard. What was produced 200 years ago. Essentially there was more fabric available to somebody in the 18th century than what's available to us today, if we don't include things like synthetic fibers. There was so much available, just so much available that's just no longer produced because it's too costly or nobody likes it or too hard to maintain. But trying to find those vendors that do produce, that do sell, these textiles would be the next step. And I find that most of them will be pretty helpful if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. But trying to stay away from synthetic materials, trying to stay away from, if we know that the majority of linen shirts and shifts are made from linen, then you probably want to try to find some linen to make it out of, even though it might be a little bit more expensive. But I think in the end, you will be far more rewarded with your project if you spend that little bit more money on the textile and take your time with it, than if you just rush out or buy something or buy the wrong material. Because it's a big time investment. Particularly if you're doing it by hand. There's a lot of time invested into these objects that we create.
And I think that kind of brings me to my next question. We'll go back to talking about men's clothing. Do you think there's any other reasons why there are more women who are sewing professionally versus men who are sewing professionally? Because I don't know that there's more women sewing in general in 18th century than men. Because most of the men that I know are sewing their own things.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I find, and I'm not sure if this might be true for you, but if you find a unit that you're in, particularly like a uniformed Continental Army or British Army unit, they generally have a sort of a go-to person who makes clothing for that unit, if it's a uniform, so to speak. Some of the other groups out there that are sort of militia. So they're, basically wearing civilian clothing. I find it's a little bit more sort of wide open in terms of who's sewing, men, women,
Hmm.
a lot more variety there. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Good question, but I don't know if I have a good answer.
It's something to think about. Um, hunting shirt. Why is that
Yeah.
the thing for you? What is it? What drew you in?
I to me, back when I was working on that research, and I still work on that research every single day, it seems. It is a very strange garment. It only shows up here in North America. It's very isolated prior to the outbreak of the American Revolution. And there's a lot of sort of, let's say, myth conceptions about the object, and a lot of it swirls around a couple early publications, mostly the book that was published, "The Private Soldier Under Washington," where there was an image of this hunting shirt that was owned by a sculptor, that was published as one from the Revolution. Um, and so you have a lot of competing descriptions of what these things are. The primary sources point to that they were fringed, they were split down the front, they had capes around their necks. But the later descriptions, and mostly pointing at this one object that survives, we don't know where it is today, but there's a photograph of it. Has it as a sort of a pullover shirt. So my interest was, is it a pullover? Is it not a pullover shirt? Is it, what can we dig out from, one, the extant pieces? What can they show us about these things? And then what can we glean from the historic references as well? And so I think for years and years and years and years, folks had sort of compiled these, but not necessarily into one thing, one thesis. And so that was sort of my goal when I wrote that back in 2013, 2011, somewhere back then.
What about the relationship of that shirt to, what is it, the frock, the coat? What are this thing that we see show up with so many militia people, so many men in militias are wearing this garment, right? And
Yeah.
and what's the story behind that, and does it make sense that so many people are wearing this same similar garment?
Yeah, I mean, I think by the time the war breaks out, the hunting shirt itself is really localized to the backcountry of Virginia and Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Worn primarily by folks who are probably hunting deer skins for the deerskin trade. And it is a very weird hodgepodge of Anglo-American, European dress, probably mixed with a good bit of Native American as well, particularly with the fringes, which really seem to serve no purpose that I've ever been able to come up with a primary source, at least. So it's very localized. So prior to 1775, it's very, very, very local garment. After Washington adopts it as the uniform for the Continental Army, and the guys up in New England, they don't know what this thing is. He's having to send patterns to them. So I think once we find that adoption, that sort of Continental Army widespread, we see these things all over the place very rapidly because they're cheap. They make you appear as if you're a marksman, so you have that sort of psychological effect. And so I think, for folks who are doing a militia impression, particularly Southern, it's fine. For New Englanders, probably post the adoption of the uniform, it would be fine as well. We know that they become very widespread. There's a widespread popularity of them post-war, particularly in New England militias, and they do see some use during the War of 1812 as well, but that'll be sort of the last hurrah for them, at least as a military garment. And people very, very quickly forget what these objects, as generations progress, they quickly forget what this garment is and what it meant. George Washington Parke Custis writes it as the emblem of the Revolution. And Jonathan Trumbull actually has to go back because he, of course, installs those great portraits in the Capitol Rotunda, and one of them features Daniel Morgan wearing a hunting shirt, and he's asked to sort of write a visitor's guide. That's probably the best way to describe it, and basically has to describe what a hunting shirt is because people don't know what it is. They don't understand in the 1820s. So as quickly as it was adopted and used, and independence was won and won again in the War of 1812, the garment really fades from fashion rapidly.
It has a longer shelf life than the parachute pants of hourglass. But I feel like trying to explain that to my teenagers, they would not know what parachute pants are. All right, let's talk about your offerings, your website, your YouTube videos, all the things that you have available. We were talking about all these resources, and you have so many of these resources. So share a little bit about those resources with us.
Sure. I have a web page. It is nealhursttailor.com. And there I have a resource page, which has my own publications and research that I publish just because I find it interesting. So you can go on there, and everything there is free to download and to take a look underneath the resource tab. You can also contact me there. You can also contact me through Facebook or Instagram, also Neal Hurst Tailor on both of them. And recently, in light of the COVID pandemic, we had several of us had discussed sort of doing a video component to our 18th century menswear group, which is on Facebook. And what we've been doing is a wide variety of topics, looking at breeches and coats and waistcoats and construction and how to put things together, but also sort of lead individuals through, as what I've just called them, as sort of tours through antiques. So really allowing individuals who don't necessarily have access to antique garments, allowing them that access by sort of looking at photographs and sort of discussing what I find interesting about it, or what is typical, what is not typical about these antiques that do survive. And so we've got a couple of them on my YouTube, again, Neal Hurst Tailor. And there's also a lot of discussion on a variety of other topics on there as well, sort of dressing for the heat. I hope to release one on walking sticks, and from Mark Wallace's collection, who's a private collector in the UK. Mark has been fantastic in sharing a lot of his antique pieces. So we've been able to go through a lot of things, waistcoats and shirts. So you can really see a lot there.
That's really cool. And I know that you're working on some classes eventually as well, some virtual offerings, and in addition to your in-person offerings.
Ideas.
Yeah.
Cooking some ideas more than anything right now. I have a lot of interest in people wanting hunting shirts, which I'm very grateful for and happy to make for them. But trying to come up with some kind of virtual component to lead you through making your own hunting shirt. We'll see where that goes. We're still working on that.
Well, it's pandemic times. It's like, I feel like you just don't make plans, no matter what, whether you're planning to be in person, whether you're planning to produce videos, just don't make plans. And then it just, I don't know, it's working for me. That's how. Okay.
Well, that's good.
So people can reach out to you and talk to you if they want to purchase a hunting shirt from you, and you can talk to them about that. And then obviously, wherever people are watching this, go check out your social media, Facebook, Instagram, your YouTube channel, and the website where there's all the fun stuff on there. Neal, it has been a delight. I feel like we could talk for hours about all the things, and I appreciate all that you do to help people and help beginners out. And thank you so much for taking the time to come chat today.
Sure. Anytime. Happy to talk.